We're now going to talk about Section 3 of Chapter 15, which is what is the real meaning of black freedom? Land was one of the major desires of the freed people. Frustrated by responsibility for the growing numbers of freed people following his troops, General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, in which land in Georgia and South Carolina was to be set aside as a homestead for the freed people. Sherman lacked the authority to confiscate and distribute land, so this plan never really took full effect. One of the main purposes of the Freedmen's Bureau, however, was to redistribute lands to former slaves that had been abandoned and confiscated by federal government officials. Even these land grants were short-lived. In 1866, land that ex-Confederates had left behind was reinstated to them. Freed people's hopes of land reform were unceremoniously dashed as Freedmen Bureau's agents held meetings with the freedmen throughout the South, telling them the promise of land was not going to be honored, that instead they should plan to go back to work for their former owners as wage laborers. The policy reversal came as quite a shock. In one instance, Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner General Oliver O. Howard went to Edisto Island to inform the black population there of the policy change. The Black Commission's response was that we were promised homesteads by the government. You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island? The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, that man I cannot well forgive. Does it look as if he's forgiven me, seeing how he keeps trying to put me in a condition of helplessness? In working to ensure that crops could be harvested, agents sometimes coerced former slaves into signing contracts with their former masters. However, the Bureau also instituted courts where African Americans could seek redress if their employers were abusing them or not paying them. The last ember of hope for land redistribution was extinguished when Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner proposed land reform bills that were tabled in Congress, meaning they weren't going to be even addressed. Radicalism had its limits, and the Republican Party's commitment to economic stability eclipsed their interest in radical justice. Another aspect of the pursuit of freedom was the reconstitution of families. Many freed people immediately left plantations in search of family members who had been sold away. Newspaper ads sought information about long-lost relatives. People placed those ads until the turn of the 20th century, demonstrating the enduring pursuit of family reunification. Freedmen sought to gain control over their own children or other children who had been apprenticed to white masters either during the war or as a result of black codes. Above all, freed people wanted freedom to control their families. Many freed people rushed to solemnize unions with formal wedding ceremonies. Black people's desire to marry fit the government's goal to make free black men responsible for their own households and to prevent black women and children from becoming dependent on the government. Freed people placed a great emphasis on education for their children and themselves. For many, the ability to finally read the Bible for themselves induced work-weary men and women to spend all evening or Sunday attending night school or Sunday school classes. It was not uncommon to find a one-room school with more than 50 students ranging in age from 3 to 80. As Booker T. Washington famously described the situation, it was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. Many churches served as schoolhouses and as a result became central to the freedom struggle. Free and freed black Southerners carried well-formed political and organizational skills into freedom. They developed anti-racist politics and organizational skills through anti-slavery organization turned church associations. Liberated from white-controlled churches, black Americans remade their religious worlds according to their own social and spiritual desires. One of the more marked transformations that took place after emancipation was the proliferation of independent black churches and church associations. In the 1930s, nearly 40% of 663 black churches surveyed had their organizational roots in the post-emancipation era. Many independent black churches emerged in rural areas, and most of them had never been affiliated with white churches. Many of these independent churches were quickly reorganized into regional, state, and even national associations, often by brigades of Northern and Midwestern free blacks who went to the South to help the freedmen. Through associations like the Virginia Baptist State Convention and the Consolidated American Baptist Missionary Convention, Baptists became the fastest growing post-emancipation denomination, building on their anti-slavery associational roots and carrying on the struggle for black political participation. Tensions between Northerners and Southerners over style of worship and educational requirements strained these associations. Southern, rural black churches preferred worship services with more emphasis on inspired preaching, while Northern urban black churches favored more orderly worship and educated ministry. Perhaps the most significant internal transformation in churches had to do with the role of women, a situation that eventually would lead to the development of independent women's conventions in Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal churches. Women like Nannie Helen Burroughs and Virginia Broughton, leaders of the Baptist Women's Convention, worked to protect black women from sexual violence from white men. Black representatives repeatedly articulated this concern in black constitutional conventions early in the Reconstruction era. In churches, women continued to fight for equal treatment and access to the pulpit as preachers, even though they were able to vote in church meetings. Black churches provided centralized leadership and organization in post-emancipation communities. Many political leaders and office holders were ministers. Churches were often the largest building in town and served as community centers. Access to pulpit and growing congregations provided a foundation for ministers' political leadership. Groups like the Union League, militias, and fraternal organizations all used the regalia, ritual, and even hymns of churches to inform and shape their practice. Black churches provided space for conflict over gender roles, cultural values, practices, norms, and political engagement. With the rise of Jim Crow, black churches would enter a new phase of negotiating relationships within the community and the wider world. Now we'll move to Section 4, Reconstruction and Women. Reconstruction involved more than the meaning of emancipation. Women also sought to redefine their roles within the nation and their local communities. The abolitionist and women's rights movements simultaneously converged and began to clash. In the South, both black and white women struggled to make sense of a world of death and change. In Reconstruction, leading women's rights advocate Elizabeth Cady Stanton saw an unprecedented opportunity for disenfranchised groups. Women, as well as black Americans, North and South, could seize political rights. Stanton formed the Women's Loyal National League in 1863, which petitioned Congress for a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. The 13th Amendment marked a victory not only for the anti-slavery cause, but also for the Loyal League, proving women's political efficacy and the possibility for radical change. Now, as Congress debated the meanings of freedom, equality, and citizenship for former slaves, women's rights leaders saw an opening to advance transformations in women's status too. On May 10th of 1866, just 1 year after the war, the 11th National Women's Rights Convention met in New York City to discuss what many agreed was an extraordinary moment, full of promise for fundamental social change. Elizabeth Cady Stanton presided over the meeting. Also in attendance were prominent abolitionists with whom Stanton and other women's rights leaders had joined forces in the years leading up to the war. Addressing this crowd of social reformers, Stanton captured the radical spirit of the hour. Now in the Reconstruction, she declared, is the opportunity, perhaps for the century, to base our government on the broad principle of equal rights for all. Stanton chose her universal language, equal rights for all, with intention, setting an agenda of universal suffrage. Thus, in 1866, the National Women's Rights Convention officially merged with the American Anti-Slavery Society to form the American Equal Rights Association. This union marked the culmination of a long-standing partnership between abolitionists and women's rights advocates. The AERA was split over whether black male suffrage should take precedent over universal suffrage, given the political climate of the South. Some worried that political support for freedmen would be undermined by the pursuit of women's suffrage. For example, AERA member Frederick Douglass insisted that the ballot was literally a question of life or death for Southern black men, but not for women. Some African-American women challenged white suffragists in other ways. Frances Harper, for example, a free-born black woman living in Ohio, urged them to consider their own privilege as white and middle class. Universal suffrage, she argued, would not so clearly address the complex difficulties posed by racial, economic, and gender inequality. These divisions came to a head early in 1867 as the AERA organized a campaign in Kansas to determine the fate of black and women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her partner in the movement, Susan B. Anthony, made the journey to advocate universal suffrage, yet they soon realized that their allies were distancing themselves from women's suffrage in order to advance black enfranchisement. Disheartened, Stanton and Anthony allied instead with white supremacists who supported women's equality. Many fellow activists were dismayed by Stanton's and Anthony's willingness to appeal to racism in order to advance their own cause. These tensions finally erupted over conflicting views of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Women's rights leaders vigorously protested the 14th Amendment. Although it established national citizenship for all persons born or naturalized in the United States, the amendment also introduced the word male into the Constitution for the first time. After the 15th Amendment ignored sex as an unlawful barrier to suffrage, an omission that appalled Stanton, the AERA officially dissolved. Stanton and Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, or the NWSA, while suffragists who supported the 15th Amendment, regardless of its limitations, founded the American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA. The NWSA soon rallied around a new strategy called the New Departure. This approach interpreted the Constitution as already guaranteeing women the right to vote. They argued that by nationalizing citizenship for all people and protecting all rights of citizens, including the right to vote, the 14th and 15th Amendment guaranteed women's suffrage as well. Broadcasting the New Departure, the NWSA encouraged women to register to vote, which roughly 700 did between 1868 and 1872. Susan B. Anthony was one of them, and she was arrested but acquitted in trial. In 1875, the Supreme Court addressed this constitutional argument, acknowledging women's citizenship but arguing that suffrage was not a right guaranteed to all citizens. This ruling not only defeated the New Departure but also coincided with the court's broader reactionary interpretation of the Reconstruction amendments that significantly limited freedmen's rights. Following this defeat, many suffragists like Stanton increasingly replaced the idea of universal suffrage with arguments about the virtue that white women would bring to the polls. These new arguments often hinged on racism and declared the necessity of white women voters to keep black men in check. Advocates for women's suffrage were largely confined to the North, but Southern women were experiencing social transformations as well. The lines between refined white womanhood and degraded enslaved black femaleness were no longer so clearly defined. Moreover, during the war, Southern white women had been called on to do traditional men's work, chopping wood and managing businesses. While white Southern women decided whether and how to return to their prior status, African American women embraced new freedoms and a redefinition of womanhood. The Civil War showed white women, especially upper-class women, life without their husbands' protections. Many did not like what they saw, especially given the possibility of racial equality. Formerly, wealthy women hoped to maintain their social status by rebuilding the pre-war social hierarchy. Through ladies' memorial associations and other civic groups, Southern women led efforts to bury and memorialize the dead, praising and bolstering their men's masculinity through nationalist speeches and memorials. Ladies' Memorial Associations, or LMAs, grew out of Soldiers' Aid Society and became the precursor and custodian of the Lost Cause narrative. Proponents of the Lost Cause tried to rewrite history of the antebellum South to de-emphasize the brutality of slavery. They also created the myth that the Civil War was fought over states' rights instead of slavery, which was the actual cause. LMAs and their ceremonies created new holidays during which white Southerners could reaffirm their allegiance to the Confederacy and express their opposition to black rights. For instance, some LMAs celebrated the anniversary of Stonewall Jackson's death on May 10th. Through these activities, Southern women took on political roles in the South. Southern black women also sought to redefine their public and private lives. Their efforts to control their labor met the immediate opposition of white Southern women. Gertrude Clanton, a plantation mistress before the war, disliked cooking and washing dishes, so she hired an African-American woman to do the washing. A misunderstanding quickly developed. The laundress, nameless in Gertrude's records, performed her job and returned home. Gertrude believed that her money had purchased a day's labor, not just the load of washing, and she became quite furious. Meanwhile, the washerwoman and others like her set wages and hours for themselves, and in many cases began to take washing into their own homes in order to avoid the surveillance of white women and the sexual threat that posed by white men. Similar conflicts raged across the South. White Southerners demanded that African American women work in the plantation home and instituted apprenticeship systems to place African American children in unpaid labor positions. African American women combated these attempts by refusing to work at jobs without fair pay or fair conditions, and by clinging tightly to their children. Like white LMA members, African American women formed clubs to bury their dead, to celebrate African American masculinity, and to provide aid to the communities. On May 1st of 1865, African Americans in Charleston created the precursor to the modern Memorial Day by mourning the Union dead buried hastily on a racetrack turned prison. Like their white counterparts, the 300 African American women who participated had been members of the local Patriotic Association, which aided freed people during the war. African American women continued participating in Federal Decoration Day ceremonies and later formed their own club organizations. Racial violence, whether city riots or rural vigilantes, continued to threaten those vulnerable households. Nevertheless, the formation and preservation of African American households became a paramount goal for African American women. For all their differences, white and black Southern women faced a similar challenge during Reconstruction. Southern women celebrated the return of their brothers, husbands, and sons, but couples separated by many years struggled to adjust. To make matters worse, many of these former soldiers returned with physical and mental wounds. For white families, suicide and divorce became more acceptable, while the opposite occurred for black families. Since the entire South suffered from economic devastation, many families were impoverished and sank into debt. All Southern women faced economic devastation, lasting wartime trauma, and enduring racial tensions. And this brings us to an end of Section 4.